Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our 6th wine tasting event for our clients at Presilium Private Wealth. We are grateful to be here with all of you, and if you are here, then you are very important to us. Our life's work is to ensure that all of you can reach your financial goals. Our entire business is built around that mission. At the start of the year, we gave you 3 reasons we were optimistic about 2023. And so far, we have been right. We had a great first quarter. And in our most recent Financial Planning Fridays video, just posted to our YouTube channel and our website just an hour ago, we are ready to give you 2 additional reasons to be optimistic for the remainder of this year that we think you'll really enjoy and find interesting. However, just because we continue to be optimistic does not mean we will be complacent. As usual, we are ready to take advantage of whatever the market and the world give us next. Now, I don't want to stand in the way any longer of 3 amazing bottles of wine and our fantastic sommelier. Please let me introduce my good friend, Brandon of Vin-Decision, who is going to guide us through a wine tasting of 3 different white wines that are all grown near volcanoes. Brandon, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us again.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me back. My name is Brandon. As Jerry said, I used to be a wine director in New York City. I was at Charlie Bird for about 5 years before the pandemic. When the pandemic occurred, I shifted and started my own business, and much of that, because of remote circumstances, was in creating virtual tastings for clients. At this point, I'm around 500, 550, somewhere around there in terms of delivered virtual tastings. And this is one of my favorite things to do. I do, I guess, a lot of things in life, but I love being able to connect with people all around the country for this Zoom, but sometimes I do all around the world, bring to you also some of the most exciting producers, at least in my mind, along with some of the most exciting regions. And so we can learn along together, we can taste along together. And I think that is really important, this tasting, as we kind of taste each wine at the same moment, going through the sort of same actions, maybe smelling similar things. This is what creates a sort of camaraderie that you don't even really get without Zoom, to be honest. Like, yeah, we could go into like a big room and stuff like this and get together, and that would be fun. But in the privacy of your own home, you can kind of be a little bit more comfortable. You can lean into your wines a little bit more. Wine, and I'm aware of this, wine is an intimidating topic. I never went to wine school, went to a lot of other schools, but I found wine in my own way. I was lucky enough to open some great wines while I was at Charlie Bird. And that really helped me because I'd sometimes taste 100 wines in a day. So my palate would get very refined because of that. But I forged my own relationship with it. And so I speak about it, I talk about it in my own way. And that's what I want you to do. I encourage you to speak about wine in your own way, to kind of interact with it in your own way, because this is a very personal and subjective experience. We're using our senses, our nose and our mouth primarily. And that's something that we don't often do in other facets of our life. So be aware. I mean, yeah, it can be kind of tricky. But hopefully by the end of this, I will have given you, imparted you some techniques and certainly maybe some phrases or language that you can use in your own life. So make sure you know this tasting is for you. It's for you to maybe utilize some of this information when you're at a wine store or at a restaurant. And because of that, we want you to ask questions. So utilize the what you'll see is the question and answer, the Q&A box. Make questions happen throughout, and I will get to all of them, and I will answer all of them. Ideally, these questions are about wine, but as you wish. And so even if it's not about the exact wine we're talking about, bring your question. I promise you it's important. Now, you see 3 wines in front of you. We're starting with Bubbles. You're going to tell me, well, Bubbles isn't really a white wine. You're kind of correct, but I did this for a reason. And so follow along. First of all, cheers. Cheers to all of you. I think we should always start with the cheers. If you've already been sipping on these wines, this is a no shame zone. That's okay. We're not going to call you out. These wines are absolutely for you. But we're going to start with the sparkling tonight. We're going to go to the Soave Classico, which is the bottle that looks like it says Genie or Genie on top. And then we're going to end with the Fiano Diavolino. You can go back and forth as you wish, but this is how I'm going to talk about these wines. And if we're looking at a map, which we're about to, we'd be looking from north to south. Along this way, I'm going to bring up different maps, different images, different ways in which to immerse you in these places to hopefully this helps kind of place everything for you. But again, use the question box. We'll get to it. And here we go. So all of these wines tonight are from Italy, and Italy is one of my favorite places to talk about. It is one of the most complicated countries as it regards wine. But because of that, it's one of the most fascinating. You could spend a few lifetimes over studying Italian wine, Italian viticulture, the traditions, the different terroir, the different grapes. And even then, you probably wouldn't be done. And what I love about this map, and we'll zoom in so you don't have to strain your eyes or anything, but what I love about this map, just looking at it from this vantage point, is how many places are colored in. When you look at a lot of wine maps around the world, a lot of countries' wine maps, you'll see that there's a lot of blank space. And while you could, point out some blank spaces here if you really wanted to, the whole country more or less is colored in by vines, by viticulture, by wine fuels this country in many ways. It is so important. It is so distinct depending on where you are in the country. And it is so rich and diverse in its history. This is sort of fascinating, and it's really fantastic because a lot of places can't boast this. When you're in the north, and we are starting in the very north with this sparkling wine. In fact, we're starting in Trentino Alto Adige. When you're in the north, you have a totally different perspective of wine than when you're all the way in the south, let's say Sicily. Down here, it can get really hot. And therefore, you have wines that are often going to be big, boisterous, reds that are very juicy, motivated primarily by sunshine. But when you're all the way up here, you have a very mountainous area. In this circumstance, you have mountains that were formed by volcanoes millions of years ago. But what that means is that all of these mountainous, all of these hillsides create a very different style of wine, a very different perspective of wine. When you're in the north where it's cooler and colder, you have wines that are more motivated by some of the earthy scents. So it's not going to be sunshine all year round. Sometimes there's a lot of elevation. And so as opposed to some of those juicier fruity notes, we have other notes that we're going to rely upon. And that kind of frames this discussion pretty well. Notice also that Italy, if you're just going to generalize, is probably better known for its red wines over its white wines. That is to say, Barolo and Barbaresco tend to be household names. Brunello, you could throw in there, Chianti Classico. You could keep going on, Super Tuscans. And because of that, because of these big names, because of these big reputations, we tend to unfairly overlook the white wines of Italy. And the white wines of Italy are some of my favorite. I'm a big Chablis fan. So Chablis in France, it's Burgundy. And many of the wines in Italy don't cost nearly as much as Chablis or white Burgundy, but they tend to perform in a similar manner. And we just don't know because people aren't putting them in front of us enough. So this is your chance to taste some of the great wines of the world that happen to be from Italy. So we are in sparkling territory, and know that sparkling as its own category is very confusing. Some of you may already know that champagne is not a moniker that you can put on to any sparkling wine. That is to say, you're in California, they make sparkling wine there, and you ask for a glass of champagne. That's not correct. At least, it's not supposed to be that way, in the sense that champagne is a place in France, where they make this wine called champagne. In California, they make sparkling wine. Sometimes it can be just as good as champagne, but it is very different. This idea that there's an identity behind champagne, again, this place called Champagne, which makes champagne, is very important. And so in our glass, we have a sparkling wine from Italy. It is not champagne because it's not from there, but it is made exactly like it. So if you've already taken a sip, I hope you're somewhat impressed by the finesse and by the kind of tiny bubbles, by the overall elegance of this wine, which I think we're not always expecting from an Italian sparkler. Oftentimes you probably think maybe we're going to go Prosecco, and Prosecco is sold just about anywhere that you can walk into. Prosecco can be pretty good. And in fact, I have a handful of excellent Prosecco, but oftentimes there are different methods that go into it. And so sparkling as a wine category can be some of the best juice in the world. It can also be stuff that's somewhat lackluster. And it's important to find your producers for sure, but it's also important to know where it's coming from, because some places do better than others. How does everyone like the sparkling? You can put it in the Q&A. I really like this bottle. It's from Ferrari, which you'll see on the label. Ferrari is, of course, a car company. It has nothing to do with this. But this is one of the standard bearers of great sparkling in all of Italy. Some of you may have never seen this bottle before. It oftentimes doesn't show up often, show up on a lot of wine menus or wine stores, but it is there. And it is brilliant in my mind. Some questions, Jerry?
Yes, we did have a first question from our good friend Debbie in Jacksonville, Florida. She had heard that you should not pair champagne or sparkling wine with anything that has fat in it, like cheese. What do you think of that? And what would you recommend pairing this with?
Cool. Good question. So champagne, because there can be also in sparkling wine, because there can be so many different styles, it's hard to generalize it. For instance, there's a lot of sparkling wine. There's also a lot of champagne that are on the very, very dry side. And when I say dry, I mean like there's no real kind of depth. Sometimes that acidity at the back end is overpowering and tends to be austere. When you have that situation, then I would say correct. Like this wine is not going to do super well with cheese or with fat or with anything kind of above that. I agree. And that's where you stay maybe toward that kind of raw fish category. But because the styles can be so diverse, there is we'll kind of keep on with the questions. I want to show in terms of kind of like atmosphere, climate, etc. We are in this really beautiful northern Italian area called Trentino, also sometimes called Trentino Alto Adige. And here it is where all this mountainside, which is volcanic origin, this is kind of where the vineyards are set. It is a rather majestic place. It is a place you don't often associate with wine because, I mean, how can you make vineyards here? How can wine happen here? But it does. And when it does happen, or when vineyards occur in these places, the wines, this kind of hillside vineyard, which is oftentimes, and these are all vineyards in this foreground, oftentimes very hard to cultivate and farm. Oftentimes you have to just do it by hand. There's no tractor mechanization that can fit through here, but it makes these vines try really hard to survive. And so when these vines try really hard to survive in a relatively harsh climate, because again, the sun isn't just pumping down all day, they are thought to dig deeper into that bedrock, and in this case, into that bedrock that has volcanic origin, and bring out that minerality that's there. So one reason that why this sparkling is exciting and interesting is simply because where it comes from. It's this part of Italy that is very much unlike many other parts of the world. And that's what you want, this idea of terroir, which we are going to explore. That's what you want in a wine. You want a wine that has personality, that has identity, that is able to speak for itself when it's on the table of other wines. And so this is a major reason why this wine tastes good, why this wine is relatively active and it's moving and it keeps you intrigued for the next sip. Jerry, I know, yeah. I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, Brandon, we had another question about this one.
Yeah.
This is from our friend Blaze near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Do the bubbles do anything to the nose of the wine to change it or make it more pronounced?
Yes, great question. I like this question. In my opinion, big time. So the bubbles, the bubbles which are caused by carbon dioxide, and I'll go into the process real quickly right after this. But yes, I think when you smell a sparkling wine, you're sometimes hit by all that CO2, and sometimes it makes the aromas a little bit harder to actually grab onto and smell. This is the great debate of sparkling glasses, and some of you may have heard this debate before, but here's a glass that I use for sparkling wine. This is sparkling. I like this glass as opposed to like a flute or as opposed to a coupe, because it acts like an actual wine when it's in this glass. It's allowed to breathe, just like if you have your white wines and you're swirling, you have the red wines and you're swirling. It's allowed to breathe. Some of that CO2 dissipates in an easier way, but it holds on to that nose. So after I swirl and then I smell, all of a sudden there's some actual wine characteristics coming out. It's not just that CO2 that I'm smelling or absorbing. And so glassware is a big thing, and that will totally change what your sparkling wine tastes and smells like. So if you haven't tried it, try a glass like this and see what happens.
Brandon, we had another good question from my good friend John in Pennsylvania. In the off chance that we don't finish this tonight, is there any way you can store sparkling wine?
Totally. And so you'll notice, and I've tried this many times because I didn't think it was real. If you don't have one of those metal clamps, and if you drink enough sparkling in your house, these metal clamps can be bought anywhere. Amazon, I think Crate & Barrel has some nice ones for like $5 or $10. But these metal clamps are the best way. And that kind of creates a seal. It ensures that not too much oxygen is going back and forth. However, if you don't have those, that's totally fine. Do not try to put the cork or a cork back onto the bottle, because all the gas that's still trapped in the bottle is going to shoot the cork out. It might not seem that way immediately, but it will over time. Simply put the bottle back into the fridge, uncorked, and it will stay fresh there for about 2 more days. Like the bubbles will still be there. There's so many bubbles in this bottle. There's so much gas that is still there that you don't need to worry about it unless it's being shooken up, like, back and forth. So if it's in a relatively stable place, no cork, no problem. Put it in the fridge. Great question.
My friend Cindy, who is also a gourmet cook and I think expert on everything wine and cooking, asked
Nice.
if this is made in the champagne method.
Yes, thank you. What a fantastic question. I was just about to get to this. So perfect segue. So there's different methods of sparkling wine that you can use. Champagne has a method champenois, named after, champagne. Other places are allowed to use this method. It's generally called something different depending on where you are. So other places can use this method. And when they use this method, it often makes the wine taste much more similar to champagne. So lots of different ways to make sparkling. One is the champagne method. This wine happens to use the champagne method. In Italy, it's called metodo classico, the classic method. And this method is often thought to be the most work intensive, the most difficult, the most expensive, but the results it produces are often the highest in quality. So when you look at other sparkling possibilities, let's say Prosecco, for instance, Prosecco can kind of have these massive, and again, not all Prosecco makes it in like a low quality way, but it could have all these massive stainless steel vats in one room, and they could pressurize the tanks, and those tanks would, then have those bubbles, essentially like making Coca-Cola in a big tank. And so those bubbles in Prosecco oftentimes are not as fine, are not as delicate as champagne or as wines made in the champagne method. Because our wine is made in the champagne method, it has to go through a very rigorous process to finally end up on the shelf. So it actually does start as white wine. This wine is 100% Chardonnay, in case you didn't know that already. It starts as white wine. However, then it goes through several different processes. It starts as white wine, then it's bottled with a crown cap. In its own individual bottle, yeast and sugar are both added in. A fermentation then happens inside the bottle. So those bubbles are occurring naturally. Then the bottles stay on what is called their lees, or all the spent yeast. So all the remnants of that, the fermentation that happens in the bottle with the yeast and sugar added. It stays on its lees for a while. It finally goes to a rack that looks like this picture, which is called a riddling rack, where people are paid, sometimes probably not paid because they're part of the family, to just move these bottles slightly to get all of that extra yeast matter to the top of the bottle. And eventually they will crack off that crown cap, which is called disgorgement. And all that matter, all of the remnants of that interbottle fermentation shoot out the bottle. And then they'll put generally a little bit more sugar in and cork it out. So it's a long process. Trust me, if you didn't follow all those steps, it took me a few times to follow all those steps myself. I've seen it in real life, so that helps. However, that's only to say, and if this is the only thing you take from that, this is a long way of making sparkling wine. From front to end, it's normally about a 4-year at minimum process to see any more cash flow coming back in. So it is a commitment. However, making that commitment allows for the possibility of what's in your glass, because there's a lot of different ways of making sparkling that will not taste like this, guaranteed. The bubbles will not be as tiny as this. The aromas will not be as subtle and delicate. And normally when you talk about kind of bready or like bread or brioche or bakery notes, it's more of this kind of champagne style if you like that. So if you're out in the world, what you want to ask for is, I like sparkling wine in the champagne method or the champagne style. This helps the wine person know a little bit more of what you're looking for in a precise manner. Great question.
Brandon, our friend Becky in St. Louis, Missouri, really liked this and wondered where she could get it. And we wondered if you had a few online sources that you've used in the past.
Totally. So when you're looking at bottles, always make sure your phone is nearby to take a picture of the bottle, provided you like it. In this case, that picture would help you because as you go to different wine stores, as you go to different places, you can simply show the wine team the bottle that you like, and then they can find something close to it. A very good tool that exists online is called winesearcher.com. That's all one word. And sometimes you can just type in, especially in this case, because it's pretty easy. When you look at this label, you see Ferrari Brut. You just type in Ferrari Brut on winesearcher.com. You pick your state, and then it shows everyone that will ship to you. It'll even then show maybe places that are nearby you or are in your state. Of course, every state has its own very exciting shipping laws regarding alcohol. So sometimes this is a complicated process, but Wine Searcher makes it very easy. So that would be my first go-to. If you have a wine shop, though, that you like and that's nearby, then I would have the conversation with them. That's the best way to understand and explore and adventure into new categories and new regions, is by that conversation. And this will give you the fuel, everything that we just said, the fuel to get into that zone that you really like. I like these, like finely made champagne wines. Or if you don't like this wine, which you are absolutely allowed to not like this wine, say, I want a wine that's maybe closer to Prosecco or made like Prosecco. Totally fine. But this is what that's for. Winesearcher.com can help.
Brandon, one more thing.
Yep.
Our friend Pascal, who I believe is in Pennsylvania now, but is originally from France,
Nice.
asked about the saber process for champagne.
Sure. Do you want like why it exists?
Yeah, I'm interested in that.
Yeah. So I need to check up the actual history of sabering, because there's probably a history that is not as apparent as it seems. However, I can tell you, when I first got into wine, sabering was not a thing. No one was looking at a sword or something nearby that it resembles a sword and saying, I bet I could make this cork fly off if I hit this bottle in the right way with this sword. Because it's oftentimes a sword or saber that people use to saber the bottle. What happens in that process, though, is that if you do it correctly along the seam of the glass, and you have to do it correctly, you can't just take a saber and start chopping away. You can see many videos of people messing this up, but you have to get the glass really cold, almost frozen at the neck. And once it is almost frozen at the neck, you follow the bottle seam. There is a seam if you look close enough to every bottle. You follow that seam, and generally with the back of the saber, so as not to chop off anything that's human, with the back of the saber, then you follow the bottle's curvature, and that should take off with that force the actual cork along with the neck of the bottle. So all of that is one piece, flies off. What that does, it's a fancy way of doing wine service, provided there's no issues. But sometimes in a perfect world, if the cork was all messed up, or if something, if it's an old bottle of champagne, sometimes that's a really good way of just getting rid of all of that at once. Does it bring more air into the champagne? Yeah, you can make that argument for sure. Is it going to do much else to the champagne? Not really. So it's really kind of showmanship, in my opinion. And I've done it many times, and knock on wood, I haven't messed it up. Only do it if you've watched YouTube videos or if you follow those directions exactly. Otherwise, do not try it. All right, let's continue the questions, Jerry, but I want to move on to the next wine. So everyone, this is your cue to move into the Soave Classico. It should kind of obviously say that on your bottle, but as you're looking at your wines also, know that because we're in the old world, which has a very specific way of understanding wine, we often are looking at labels that don't have the grape on them. That can be confusing. You need to essentially come to the table with some knowledge on your own. And this, of course, is a major consumer block, because, I mean, who has enough time to research these areas and figure out exactly what's in the bottle? But what helps is making patterns, and taking pictures of bottles help you make patterns. So this bottle, the next bottle, is Soave Classico, but that is not the grape. This is simply the region, and the Soave Classico is the region. The grape is Garganega. Are you going to see Garganega on this bottle? You are not, which is maybe supremely annoying, but it gives you an idea of what they're aiming for, right? So when we go to New World, we're often looking at labels that have the grape right front and center. If you're drinking Oregon Chardonnay, it should be pretty obviously the grape, or pretty obvious that the Chardonnay grape is right there. It's from Oregon, maybe it's from the Willamette Valley. Good to go. Here, though, we're in a very different situation. Here we're in this place called the Veneto. And again, in our sparkling, we are all the way up in Trentino. So we're pretty far north in Italy. Here we're in the Veneto. And this is an area that has actual remnants of volcanoes nearby. So it's not nearly as rocky and mountainous, but it's more of a hillside volcanic structure. But those hillsides are essentially all made of a little bit more recent volcanoes. And so you get the volcanic touch here a bit more. But Suave Classico is what we're talking about for this wine. If you like this wine, again, you need to remember that name, Suave Classico. The Classico edition is important because it's showing you that this wine is the old or the original grounds of the Suave region. To give you an idea of how to apply that to other places, Chianti is a massive region in Italy, and maybe everyone's had Chianti before. There is a smaller place in Chianti called Chianti Classico. That Classico is majorly important because it shows you the actual original terroir in like the when it was first made, when it was first designated. That's what Chianti Classico is. All the other stuff was added later through bureaucracy, through, pushing, their way in. And some of those wines can be fine. But if you're buying wine blind and you want the stamp of approval, look for that Classico. Chianti Classico oftentimes has a black rooster on the label somewhere. So that's helpful for you. If you see the black rooster, you're good to go. When we're here in Suave Classico, you need to have that Classico. Otherwise, the wine might kind of be a little bit less interesting. It might not be as exciting as you're hoping. Jerry, are we good on questions?
One final question about the sparkling, Brandon. Yes. What's the difference between things like brut, dry, different types of sparkling wine? Are they very different from depending on grape variety or how they make it?
So what is being talked about is the sugar level, and sugar level is not a bad word in wine. In fact, a lot of wines that a lot of people like have much more sugar than they would ever expect. So sugar in wine are not a problem, especially when it's in small doses. And in sparkling wines, it's almost always in small doses, unless it's a dessert wine. What this brut category is talking about is a certain kind of level of sugar. For me, I love brut because it's right in that midpoint where it has a little bit, not extra, but it's hitting that strike zone. Let's say we're on a scale of 1 to 10. Brut would probably be closer to that like 6 to 8, maybe 5 to 8 section in terms of sweetness. And again, we're not talking about a lot of sugar at all. But you could have extra brut, which is a category from like 2 to 4. So it's going to be definitely drier. You're going to notice that the palate's a little bit more stern, a little bit more austere. Some of the body might feel like it's taken away. It might take a little bit longer to open up or get used to. You can have producers that add nothing into it. Producers that add nothing, no dosage, like they basically hands off of sugar. Those are generally wines that can be really tough because of, again, the layers aren't there. The richness isn't always there. So the winemaker has to really do everything meticulously well to pull off that non-dosage or that level where nothing is added. For me, brut is a very good style to always kind of veer toward, because you know that essentially everything's balanced. Everything's going to be relatively in place. It might not be like the most ripping acid ever, which I think is a good thing, because acid is that thing that happens when your cheeks pucker. Sometimes there's too much of that in a wine, and you don't want that. And so some of this sugar, this brut level, often helps even that out. I hope that's helpful. All right, so this Suave category and what you've been looking at are Suave vineyards. So we're still in this hillside kind of manner, not necessarily those mountains, but the hills are very much prominent here. And what you get from these hillsides is the possibility of a very well ripened, a very well balanced grape. That means when you have just flatlands that you're working with, a lot of those flatlands are going to absorb all of the nutrients. They're often going to be in places where the sun might be hitting all day or the wind doesn't get to reach them. In contrast, when you're on these hillsides, what you have is a really nice environment for these grapes to be able to cool off. Oftentimes, again, that is because of wind. And then these grapes also often have to fight for their lives to survive. And when they're doing that, they're pulling all of that volcanic material out of the soil and imparting it into the glass in one way or another. I'm interested, what does everyone think about this wine? Has anyone had Soave before? My guess is you might have had it before and not known it. I'm sure there are a few that already know Soave, Soave Classico. This is one of my absolute favorite categories because not only does this wine age well, but it's always a supreme value. I can show you a lot of wines that cost 3 times this price that this wine will overperform or at least exceed expectations. And I love finding that in wine. I've seen all the fancy wine, trust me. There's probably not one fancy wine out there that I haven't tasted or seen or know how to get. And these are the wines that are most exciting to me because they talk about a place and they do it so well. I mean, this is essential mineral-driven white wine. It's made well. It's not trying to be ostentatious with a lot of these like oak flavors, like a lot of vanilla flavors, or sometimes oak can come across, depending on where you are in the world, as kind of like buttery. Those flavors aren't necessarily bad if they're done well, but what this wine is doing is showing you where it's from. This is a volcanic-driven wine from Italy that is fresh and crisp and also has complexity as you do this, as you swirl it. Understand that white wines can be just as complicated as red wines. That's something that we are not reminded of enough. And so I always encourage people to open your wines ahead of time, even if they're white wines. 30 minutes ahead of time is kind of like the minimum I would like. And if you continue to drink this wine tonight, watch how it grows, because it I think we do not, what I'm seeing is we do not see a lot of white wine being consumed in Roman or Greek times. Oh, this is an interesting question. Have these types of white wines always been produced in Italy, or are they relatively recent? This is a very good question. This is from a Zoom user. Well, I can start here. In ancient times, and this particular region, some of these regions, well, the region we're going to end with has history back to what is it, the 15th century BC. So these places go back a long time, an incredibly long time. And what we find, though, is in ancient times, there's a lot more sweet wine moving around. The sweet wine kind of reigned supreme. The sweet wine being able to live longer, to generally undergo more difficult storage conditions. And that was the flavor of the time. When I'm talking sweet wine, I'm talking like Tokai, if you've ever had Tokai. That is an old ancient wine that was the wine of royalty. So this idea of dry wine is likely very much more modern. It's much harder to make white wine that is dry than one that has sugar. Because when there's sugar in that wine, what probably happened was that the fermentation just stopped at some point and the yeast did not eat all the sugar. And so a lot of that residual sugar is just existing, it's just hanging out. And that's what makes the wine sweet. And so you can imagine making wine in ancient times, there might not have been all of the knowledge to understand, or maybe there was the knowledge, all of the resources to maintain the correct temperature, to have a wine ferment totally dry. This is what I'm thinking. And so in modern times, though, we have the technology to do this. We have the possibility to do this. And then we also have the palate to do this. We like this. They may not have liked this. Phenomenal question, though. I like this a lot. There's another question. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. What's the longest you would store a wine like this in your cellar before drinking it?
Oh, good question. If I could keep my hands off of it, 3 to sweet spot for this wine. I say that because this wine is in stainless steel. And when you're looking for wines that can really go the distance, and keep in mind, white wines can totally go the distance. One of my favorite wines is from 1978. That's not old for humans, but for wines, that's relatively old. And that wine, though, was made in wood. This wine is made in stainless steel, and it's meant for this kind of fresh iteration that you're supposed to drink within, the first few years, up to 5 years. So 3 to 4 years is the spot, or is the kind of golden range I'd be looking for. But I encourage people to do that. These white wines, think about aging some of these, especially the Fiano at the end. You will be so surprised.
And Brandon, what's the ideal temperature to drink this at? And for white wine, does it differ between different types of white wine, what temperature you would ideally drink it at?
So I think to be the least fussy is the best possibility, probably in all of life. But as it concerns wine, for sure. My wine cave, or my wine fridge, is at about 52 degrees. And that's what I like a lot of these wines to be at, but especially white wines can go a little bit below that if you wanted to, like put in the fridge or something. Keep in mind, though, that when a wine is freezing cold, you're not going to taste much. I know some people like to put their sparkling in the freezer, or white wine in the freezer. That's okay if you don't want to taste the wine. If you do want to taste the wine, it should be much closer to that, like 55 to 57 area. That's not going to be too warm by any stretch of the imagination. And what you want to have happen is to actually smell things, to actually taste things. It's not a bad thing. But if you have a wine fridge at home, look for around that kind of 52 to 55, depending on your preference. That's a nice sweet range. Reds can exist there too, because you'll take them out a little bit beforehand. And white wines, you can always put them in the fridge a little bit longer. But that's what I look for if you don't have a split level. Around there seems about perfect to me. Good question. When you're smelling and tasting wines, know that the nose is just about everything. All of what you're experiencing is essentially here. And that means when you're doing this with your wine, you're doing a lot, because you're helping that nose and helping those aromas unravel. That's important. And so if you plugged your nose and taste the wine, if you plug your nose and taste the cheese or charcuterie, whatever food might be in front of you, you won't taste much. It will very much take away from the overall sensation and situation of the wine. So always take time to smell your wines. It's going to take you a long way in terms of understanding different nuances, and it should help you enjoy the wine a lot more. Do all wines, I think this is a good question for volcanic wines. Do all wines, and I really like this Suave picture too, do all volcanic wines smell like smoke, or can you taste the volcano in them? So far, I would say not necessarily, at least for the wines that we've had, right? We can see a pretty prominent minerality. And what I say by minerality is, I mean, kind of like that earthiness, that section that's kind of tense, almost like a rockiness. So when I think of a mineral wine, I'm not thinking of a wine that has no momentum, that just you take a sip and then nothing else happens. That is not a mineral wine for me. A mineral wine has a front, a beginning, and an end. And at that end, oftentimes lasts a nice length, sometimes 60 seconds, sometimes up to 2 minutes. And it's marked by this kind of vivacity. Like there's things that are happening with each sip that keeps you intrigued. For the most part, that a lot of that's driven by minerality. So what we've seen so far is that mineral sensation in wine. which is created by volcanic origins, volcanic soils. What we're going to see in this last wine, which is the Fiano di Avellino, and now's the time to pour it if you're there. So take a nice swig of whatever's in your glass. What we see in the Fiano di Avellino and smell this wine is a different situation. We almost immediately smell the smoke. And if you don't smell that immediately, that's okay. Do this and give it a little time. But what you should start smelling is actual smoke. And sometimes it smells like a little bit like blue cheese. That might not sound like the best thing, but it's very exciting in this wine. Sometimes I just get a blue cheese vibe for that, from the aromas of Fiano di Avellino. But what you should start smelling is smoke. And that to me is really fun to find. Why does this wine smell like smoke? Because it is the only wine in our range that is close to an active volcano. Mount Vesuvius is very much a part of Campania, where we are now. And I'll kind of zoom back out because I want to show you, we've gone from the north and now we're very much closer to the south. So we were all the way up here and now we are in Campania, all the way down here near Naples. Down here, you can see, okay, now we have a place where the sunshine likely shines just about all day. We are not going to have nearly that kind of alpine climate that we saw in northern Italy, but we do have a lot of places here that do have elevation. We also have the proximity to an actual active volcano. When you have volcanoes like this, you tend to get that smoky, ashy sensation in the wine, which is kind of interesting. This is not a product of winemaking. I've had Fiano di Avellino lots of different times from a lot of different producers. This is one of the market characteristics of each one of them, the smokiness. Does everyone smell that? I'm intrigued if you do or do not. I love smelling this in wine. This is always very exciting to me. You'll see again that this wine is the grape. This one's tricky. The grape actually is Fiano. So here we do have it on the label, but it's from di Avellino. It's Fiano of Avellino. Fiano di Avellino, that's where you want your Fiano from. That's generally the place that has a very high quality strike rate. And these are wines that absolutely age quite a length of time. Sometimes 5 years, sometimes 10 years. These are the wines you want in your cellar. I think we have some questions. Right? I see.
Brandon, does the wines grown in the volcanic areas differ very much from the north and south of Italy? Does the climate and being next to a volcano affect white and red wine?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that's definitely going to be affected is the ripeness of the grapes. And generally what that translates to, I think even in this color, it's hard to see when the wines are younger, but sometimes the actual color of the wine will be a little bit more deeper hued with white wines. With red wines, you're going to have more structure. You're going to have generally a little bit more alcohol. And when you go to the north, you're going to have far more kind of like lighter iterations, more lithe wines, influenced by volcanoes. They're generally going to be kind of more like Pinot Noir type wines that tend to do very well up there. Those grapes like that area. Whereas when we go to the south of Italy, around volcanic regions, we see grapes that are a little bit more thicker skinned, grapes that tend to act more like Barolo. So they have some toughness to them. In fact, Piedmont, where Barolo comes from, at least above Piedmont, Alto Piemonte is a very volcanic region as well. But what you're going to see from north to south is more ripeness, more fruitiness, more juiciness, more body texture and structure. So if you like all those things, you want to seek out wines that are a little bit more south of Italy for the most part. It's kind of a generalization, but it's helpful to think of that. It's a good question. Is this anyone's favorite wine? Let us know in the Q&A box, because it is maybe my favorite wine of this, even though it's hard for me to tell. In front of you is the landscape. So you can see again some of these, I guess the through thread in some of these climates and some of these pictures we're watching is it is rocky. There is some semblance of elevation, but almost all of these are on hillsides. Almost all of these are only worked by hand, which takes a lot of time, which takes a lot of knowledge and know-how as well. But these are the places that are able to create wines like this. Do I have an idea of somewhere else in the world that tastes like this? For me, it's Chablis, would taste very much like this. Fiano di Avellino is the Chablis of Italy. I think I would stand by that. But I'm always intrigued by how it plays this really special personality every time it's opened. There's a wine in Northern Rhone. Well, there's a few wines in Northern Rhone, but they're made from Syrah, and that wine has a similar smoky, meaty, kind of iron tone to it that always captivates me. And these are the wines I seek out in my own free time.
Yeah, this is really good, Brandon. We're getting a lot of good feedback on all the wines, but especially this one.
Good. This is that kind of zoom up of where Campania is, because a lot of you might recognize this simply because the Amalfi Coast is relatively nearby. As I said, Naples is right here. This is kind of a hotbed for wine in general, Campania. There's a lot of Falanghina comes from here. A lot of Aglianico comes from here. But you'll see our place called Fiano di Avellino is this little kind of green spot, close enough to Pompeii, of course. And this is a place also, when you look at Italian wine maps and you see a coast nearby, that often means there have been many ancient civilizations that have come and gone through here. What is a good thing about that, and almost all of Italy is a coast, right? I think Umbria is maybe the only place that is not, that is surrounded only by Italy. So there's a lot of places, of course, also in Italy that are surrounded by different countries or that are adjacent to that. And then the coastline's always there. What this means to me is that this is such a rich wine culture as a whole, simply because so many peoples have come in and out of here. That is very much the case for Campania as a major port. Obviously all the history of Pompeii too. What that does to the winemaking tradition and culture, though, is simply enrichen it, enliven it. When you have all of these people that have come and gone through this region, they have likely, even maybe without trying to, and maybe sometimes with trying to, imparted some of their own traditions into the region. Certainly when we started up in the north in Trentino, because we are so far north up there, there's a lot of German, even within Trentino and Alto Adige, German, or there's a Germanic dialect that is primarily upheld there. They have all these different influences up there as well. But here you have all the influences of the people that have come and gone. That generally means the wine is that much better for it. So that is one of my theories of why this wine is so good.
Brandon, we had a really good question from our good friend Steph. Do you find in general that Italian wine is less expensive than French or even good California wine?
Big time. I would say Italian white wine specifically, though Italian wine, there's a lot, there's so much in Italy that you can definitely find a deal. But Italian white wine is this strange category that's relatively unexplored still. And it doesn't simply, I think also because there's so much Italian red wine that takes up so much of that spotlight that there's not enough light to share. The wines are just never going to be that expensive, even though they rival some of the best wines of the world. So if you're looking for great value, especially as spring, summer comes here, these are definitely wines I reach for. I was telling Jerry earlier that in New York, it was about 62, 63 today. I played tennis, and this is the wine I want to come back home and drink, and with a lighter meal. So look for these wines then. But yes, you can find so much great value here. Great question. That's also not to say, though, that California and the West Coast aren't making good wines, because they are. The interesting thing about both, New World, Old World, always think about New World is still sort of in their adolescent phase. They are only going up because they've only had a wine culture that's lasted for a few hundred years. We are talking about BCE when we go to Italy. So many millennia and many generations. And so these wines better be pretty damn good at this point. And they are, but totally different sides of the spectrum. In the New World, we're watching places like Oregon fastly become really interesting. And watch for Oregon Chardonnay. Everyone's looking at Pinot, watch Oregon Chardonnay. But you're seeing these places still grow. They're still finding themselves. They're still understanding the world, where Italy's probably not going to experiment with too many new things overall, but they are getting better and better in their own kind of small, closed, kind of more narrow-minded terroir and winemaking philosophies. Did we have any more questions there, Jerry? I saw one more pop up.
Brandon, just in general, I guess, because you like this flavor, would you typically seek out wines that are grown in volcanic areas when you're selecting a white wine or even a red wine?
Big time. So what we saw connect all of these wines was kind of a more and more volcanic influence, definitely most present in this wine. But if you like that, then this is a descriptor that should help you in a place that knows about wine. If you say you like white wines that are generally near or made on volcanic soil, that's a great way to introduce yourself to a wine person, but for that person to know where and what we're talking about. Oh, you might like some wines from Greece then. Maybe, like that mineral kind of saline, fresh identity might be really exciting for you. So you can start exploring that too. But for the reds, what I also like in the reds is you do often find a kind of smokiness that's there, especially when you're near more active volcanoes, but you always have that minerality. And that minerality, even if it's a high alcohol wine, really brings balance to the wine. It doesn't have to be a light wine. What it's doing is helping the wine become more complex, more complicated, adding more depth to it. So that's my argument for seeking out volcanic wines, no matter the color. And I very much suggest you do that simply because it's also going to make you look like a smarty pants in front of most people. And that's a nice way, because then the wine team, the sommelier, whomever, starts looking in their own cellar and be like, oh, this person seems to know what they're talking about. Let's pull out something that I might not have otherwise pulled out. And that might sound trite, but it happens all the time. Well, I hope you liked our exploration of Italian wines, all from volcanic regions. Ideally, we gave you some language and some other tools to use. Again, take pictures of the bottles that you liked. It is really important to help you create the patterns. It's important for you just to have on hand and show someone. If you don't finish all of these wines tonight, that's totally fine. You do want to put a cork in the still white wines. That's going to help immensely, and leave them in the fridge. They're going to be good for 2 or 3 days, like very fresh. They'll be good after that too, but that's when they're going to show their kind of biggest personality with that range. I want to thank you for participating. Thank you for jumping on Zoom. I know we have very busy lives, but this is always one of my favorite groups. Presilium really knows how to bring the heat. Thank you to the team also, and shout out to Kelly. It is very hard to get logistics together. The logistics in the world just are not easy. And she did a lot of work to bring this together. So cheers to all of you. I'm handing it off back to the Presilium team, but cheers to everyone out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. This was an excellent tasting. Thank you for suggesting that we do a volcanic white night. This was a huge success. And as usual, we learned a lot and really appreciate you spending time with us. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed spending this time with you, and will remain focused on reaching your goals in the most effective ways possible. We have many more special client events scheduled for this year, including with Brandon, and hope that you can join us for many of those as well. Good night, everyone, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.